I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling, written to be performed and then recorded in one single, flawless take. SKALD is an ongoing story, but you don't need to start from the beginning. You can jump right in with this or any other episode, and then go back to find out what you've missed with previous episodes of the podcast or with the prose volumes available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 49. The rocks of that cold, dark, dying world broke, splintered, and shattered. Those heavy, inviolable boulders, that massive, unbreakable bedrock, split in two, torn asunder by the creeping, growing, steadily moving roots. But not just any roots. They were the roots of the world tree, a mighty celestial ash, an eternal arboreal wonder, one that sprang forth from death, destruction, and devastation, that was nourished by misery, mourning, and melancholy, that was urged forward by hate, rage, and fury as it stretched out its tendrils, those knotted roots, and it tore that dying world apart at the seams. The world tree? No. A world tree. It couldn't be the world tree, because that would be impossible. That world tree, the real world tree, was still back in the elf realm. Tended to, guarded, and most importantly, observed. Watched over by those tireless teams of dwarves, the ones who cut, who sliced, who hacked away at the world tree's roots to keep it from growing, to keep it in check, to keep it from realizing its full potential. But Caleria didn't know any of that. Caleria knew none of it. All she knew was that the tree, bursting forth from the carcass of that humongous cat, had reached deep into the ground, had found the very foundations of that world, of her world, that it had seized them, wrapping its long wooden arms around them, and it had commenced to tear them apart. Her ears were filled with the thunderous cracking of that world's cold, lifeless stone, the dead slabs of rock that had long ago offered up anything valuable they might contain. The world around her, her darkened world, the only world she had ever known, shattered into rubble around her ears, and the sound, an agonizing one, shaking her to her very core, a cacophonous racket that made it impossible to speak, impossible to think, impossible to even feel. A horrible clamor that was still far, far better than what came next. Nothing. Nothing at all. As the rocks split beneath their feet, as the spastic motions of the world tree's roots sent Caleria arcing up into the air, they revealed what lay beneath that world, what lay behind it, what comprised the very underpinnings of reality itself. Nothing. A black that was colder than black, a night that was darker than night, an endless sucking void that devoured stone, trolls, and even sound itself as Caleria watched her world broken, shattered, and dissolved by that terrible emptiness. But there was one thing that the emptiness didn't touch. One thing that it couldn't touch. The roots. The roots of the world tree were too fast, too strong, imbued with some eldritch power that protected them from the void that devoured all else. Frantically, with her lungs collapsing in the vacuum, with her eyes straining to burst out of her skull, with her skin tingling with frost, Caleria grasped the roots of the tree. And she held on tightly. She fought to find purchase on that knotted, gnarled wood, struggled to find something to wrap her thin fingers around, something that would stay constant, unchanging, something that would allow her to hang on and wait out that chaotic nightmare. But she fought to no avail. Her search was fruitless as the roots continued to grow wildly, to stretch out further and further, to fill that sucking void with wood and with dirt and with leaves, to fill the vacuum with a smell that, having spent her entire life in that broken world, was unknown to her. The smell of the forest, primal and free. Though she was unable to cling to the roots of the world tree, it soon did not matter. Because wherever she looked, wherever she turned, the world tree was all around her. The trolls, rocks, that heavy full moon, even that roaring, hateful brute, that savage, that oaf, that murderer Maul was nowhere to be seen. All she saw was wood and wild, uninhibited growth, a joyous spread of life and vitality, the likes of which she could have never imagined inside her lonely tower. She slid. She bounced along the roots, the wild, twisting, impossible roots of the world tree, and soon she found that the void she traversed, the vacuum that had consumed her, was no longer empty. The world had returned, either welcomed back or possibly created anew by the world tree. And as Caleria went to open her mouth, to fill her collapsed lungs with air, suddenly she stopped. The stop was sudden, seamless, and shocking, and made even more shocking by the fact that Caleria felt no pain. Because she should have felt pain. She should have felt something. Before, she was falling, tumbling, cascading down through the void, guided only by the whimsical growth of an otherworldly tree. But now, she was no longer falling. She was no longer moving at all. She was sitting in what, as best she could tell, was dirt. Because though she wished to open her eyes, though she wished to gaze upon wherever she now found herself, she could not, because that world, the world that now surrounded her, was far, far too bright. She squinted hard. She shielded her eyes with her hands, anything to keep that glaring, warm, punishing, glorious light from blasting her vision. She felt the warmth on her skin, felt the vitality of a sun that had not yet given up the ghost, a star that existed to warm the worlds that circled it, not mock them with 4-hour days. And as her vision adjusted to the brightness of that new world, as her pupils, accustomed to the all-encompassing gloom of her home realm, as they shrank to the width of an eye of a needle, she raised her eyelids slowly. And she saw. She saw the dusty road she sat upon. She saw the cramped, chaotic buildings that towered over her, and she saw him, the savage, the brute, that murderous oaf, Maul, barreling toward her, screaming. She had no time to act, no time to defend herself. And even if she had had it, what could she have done? Her water skins, the ones she had filled with the hungry, viscous liquid, that holy flame, that sacred blaze. They were gone, lost to her, taken by the vacuum that had threatened to devour her as well. And even if they hadn't been, even if she had still held them by her side, they would have still been empty. She had used them both to save them, to save Maul from the Grollock, to save one terrible beast from another, and before that, to save Xylan. Xylan. Her heart ached as she fell back hard upon the ground. Her heart ached, not from Maul's blow, not from the full weight of that savage monster smashing into her, but from what she saw when she once again tore her eyes open. And she, laying upon that dusty road, with Maul's massive, calloused hand tightening around her throat, with his knee driving into her chest as he screamed unintelligibly, taken by madness, what she saw as she gazed out helplessly with the darkness, that inky black void of nothingness creeping in along the edges of her vision. She saw Xylan. Not the cruel, laughing, cackling scavenger that he had become, but the sad, emaciated monk, the man of broken and lost faith that he had once been. She saw his body, broken, twisted, rigor mortis setting in, even as the skin around his neck darkened and bruised into a sickening purple circle, one that she, gasping for breath, realized that she too would soon be wearing, along with the ghastly rictus grin that spread across the monk's face, even as she watched. But Xylan wasn't the only one of Maul's victims that she laid eyes upon. No, far from it. Littering the area, standing motionless around that massive, pulsing tree, frozen in postures of abject fear and terror, were countless statues, frozen trolls, transmogrified into solid stone. Though they could endure painfully the light of her dim star, they could not stand up to the brilliant, glorious sunlight that filled the new world in which they found themselves. And so, they had been fittingly transformed into the same colorless, thoughtless gray rock that had coated her realm, and standing between those motionless reminders of what had destroyed her world, her home, were people, real people, standing in shock, staring in awe at those horrible, lumpen statues. Looking out at them, She rejoiced. Though death seemed imminent, she rejoiced, because though their skin was of many colors, of countless hues and tones, not a one of them held a trace of green. And amongst those grotesque statues, those misshapen effigies, amidst those staring, gaping crowds, one figure rose above the rest. One motionless statue towered above the simple trolls, not just because of his size, but because he, alone amongst that now frozen horde, had met his demise, had greeted the coming sun, while standing proudly upon his monstrous feet. Though that massive creature, that giant, that destroyer, had stood proudly, stood whole, stood complete, as the sun's rays had hit him, as they hardened and stiffened his skin and turned him to solid stone, now there was something missing. His head. Giant's massive head was gone, removed, broken off, and stolen by the savage, the brute, the monstrous, murderous oaf who now clutched it in one hand, glaring down at her with hate and murder in his eyes. Maul, that self-proclaimed king, had found a weapon as crass, as simple, and as devastatingly effective as he was, a massive stone in the shape of a monster's head. He raised it to the sky, like an offering to some forgotten, heinous, bloodthirsty god, and he cried out in a language she could not and did not need to understand, because though she couldn't parse the words, she knew full well what they portended as she saw the massive stone block out that wonderful, magnificent sunlight, and she waited for the final crushing blow, the one that would finally grant her the freedom she had always ached to taste. But as she came to terms with that grim reality, as she came to grips with the series of disappointments and disasters that her life had been, she was once again robbed of that for which she had prepared. She once again had stolen from her the certainty of the next moment, as she and her attacker both, the sorceress and the king, were enveloped by a cracking, tumultuous energy, an eldritch power that surrounded them, blasting their minds and bodies even as it held them in place. When the coursing blast hit, Maul's grip upon Calaria's neck slackened. But though she could once again draw breath, could fill her lungs with air, her mind was overwhelmed by the surge of power that surrounded her. She fought it. She fought it far longer than Maul, whose broken, shattered psyche was the most vulnerable part of that fearsome brute. Fought it long enough to see the one true king of men collapse into the dirt next to her, eyes open, catatonic, but with his right hand still clutching that repugnant stone. But eventually, it was too much for even her. For the sorceress, for she who had spent every waking moment honing her latent magical talents, cultivating her mind, the only weapon she had against the overwhelming numbers and the brute strength of the trolls. It was too much, and though she fought it nobly, fought it mightily, she felt the trance overtake her. The gentle, lilting voice spoke out. I'll take the girl. Calaria woke in a darkened room, rich, warm, and opulent. its floors covered in thick, sumptuous rugs, its walls draped with elaborately woven tapestries, and at the center of the room, a lounge covered in pillows that felt how clouds look. Across the room, his nose buried in an illuminated manuscript, making long, elegant markings in a massive ledger, was an old man who spoke to her in a lilting, matter-of-fact voice. Your pupils were dilated, shockingly so, as if you had been raised in a cave. Clarius sat up slowly. I may as well have been. Where am I now? The old man chuckled. Why, you're on the surface, my dear. You're on the surface. The sorceress looked down. Someone had draped her in a voluminous robe. How did I get here? The old man, still without looking up, continued his note-taking. I had some of my men carry you, with all due courtesy, of course. Hence, the robe. Caleria placed her feet upon the ground, allowing the rug's piles to creep up between her toes, tickling the bottoms of her feet. She pushed herself up. What about Maul? The savage, the one who attacked me. The old man closed his book slowly, gently, so as not to disturb those ancient pages. And then he rose to his feet, allowing his long, multi-hued cloaks to stretch down to the floor. I wouldn't worry about him. Not now. He smiled gently. He held out his hand. Come. It's late, and it's dark enough for me to show you around without your discomfort. Though it must have been the middle of the night, though the sun had set long ago, after a day that the old man assured Caleria was much, much longer than 4 hours, the factories were still wide awake, buzzing with activity. But no matter how busy, how chaotic, how frantic the buildings were, how packed with swarms of busy, single-minded workers, a path opened up wherever the old man chose to lead her. As they walked, Caleria stared in awe. Never before had she seen so many people, real people, people who had not been taken by that awful, nescient infection. There were people everywhere, swarming over almost every surface, packed in so tightly that she wondered that there was air enough for all of them to breathe, especially with the way they rushed to and fro, buzzing from one task to the next. Caleria closed her eyes, and she swallowed hard, realizing that these crowds, like that marvelous, blinding sunlight, were a part of this new, vibrant world, that they were simply something to which she would have to grow accustomed. I know this is a lot for you to take in. The old man spoke without looking back at Caleria. But it's important. It is vitally important. It is crucial. You understand the breadth and the significance of what we are building. Caleria stepped to the side, clearing the way for a howling worker, blood gushing from a jagged wound in his hand. Are these. Are they craftsmen? The old man laughed hard enough that his purposeful march slowed for an ever so brief moment, allowing the busy workers to crowd back into the path that they had cleared for him. No, no, my dear. Far from it. A craftsman creates something. These are merely workers. They perform a simple task over and over again. They're automatons. Caleria watched in disgust as the howling worker was shoved aside, forced to the ground by workers eager to take his place, willing to fight one another for the privilege. But they look like men and women. Her eyes scanned the massive, cavernous room. Children, even. The old man glanced back over his shoulder. Looks can be deceiving. His eyes twinkled in that wrinkled face. But you knew that already, didn't you, Caleria? Leaving the squabbling workers behind, Caleria rushed to keep up with her host, who had begun to pick his way through the crowd of workers once again. How do you know my name? I regret having to put you under my spell, but ultimately, I'm glad that I did, because while you were out, I was able to learn so very much about you. Despite her best efforts, Caleria's voice began to rise in excitement. Your spell? Are you a sorcerer? The old man chuckled once again. Would that I was, my dear. Would that I was. Things would have been so much easier. He sighed and smiled sadly. No, while you were given your abilities, yours to hone and to use as you wish, I had to study endlessly, to work tirelessly. I had to learn mine. I am no sorcerer, my dear. I am a wizard. Caleria's anger began to rise, began to boil within her. Nothing has been given to me. You have no idea what I've given up, what I've sacrificed. He placed a hand on her shoulder, gently. My dear girl, I never said your gifts were given free of charge. I know about the monk. Poor, sad, cursed creature. The sorceress suddenly found herself overcome with melancholy, and by the time the wizard touched a single finger to her temple, her rage had subsided completely. His cost is one that no one ever wishes to pay, my dear. I was trapped for your entire life. The power, he gave it to me. But you could not use it. No, not how I wished. You could only use it for his will. His twisted will. The old man guided Caleria, caught in a trance, guided her through his crowded factory. And I shall teach you to twist it and turn, to use his gifts to achieve other ends, better ends. Galeria's rage flared back up, unbidden. Maul, I will see him burn! Perhaps, in due time, perhaps. He now touched 2 fingers to Galeria's temple. But for now, ours is another task. Maul. Galeria struggled. We'll wait. Yes. While you learn to use your magic. While I gain control. Because that is the root of magic. Because that is real magic. That is its essence. This is true magic. The wizard opened his arms wide, his cloak billowing with his motions. True magic. To make beasts, men, gods, and even him himself work for you. Galeria turned to the old man. Teach me. I will. The wizard smiled as he ran his hand across that angry purple birthmark. And together, we will rule Ravenna. I hope you're enjoying SKALD. I hope you're loving SKALD. As I'm sure you're aware, SKALD is a completely DIY podcast. I'm not part of a big network or corporate conglomerate, and I have zero marketing budget. That's why positive word of mouth, including reviews, is so very important. I am always supremely appreciative of iTunes reviews, but today, I want to talk to you about reviews of the SKALD prose volumes on Amazon. The prose volumes, in addition to being another way for me to monetize the show, are a great way to reach a brand new audience. Hopefully funneling them back to this, the podcast, how SKALD is meant to be enjoyed. If you haven't already, please go leave reviews for volumes 1 and 2 on Amazon. If you leave a good one, I'll read it on an upcoming episode of the show. This one comes from BP. SKALD continues to take twists and turns, keeping the journey of King Maul moving at a steady clip. If you like the first book, you'll dig the second collection. The scenery and circumstances change rapidly enough to always keep you wondering what's next. Sitterson's descriptions are flowery in the darkest and most satisfying way possible. While reading, you'll hear a storyteller in your head whispering and shouting the action. Take my advice and buy this book. Your grandchildren will thank you for the inheritance. Reviews are crucial, but the best way to help the show out is monetarily. Through a small monthly contribution at patreon.com/skald. What are 4 brand new episodes a month worth to you? Do the math and sign up at patreon.com/skald today. Whether you sign up or not, I hope to hear from you soon on social media. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Snapchat. Or hit up AubreyCitizen.com for links to everything, including SKALD, my comics work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. This week's recommendation is actually something that I've written, and it comes out tomorrow, February 24th, 2016. It's Street Fighter G.I. Joe #1, a brand new comic series from IDW Publishing. It'll be available at all finer comic book shops, as well as digitally. If your shop is sold out by the time you get there, or you just don't have room for all that paper, head to Comixology.com and search for Street Fighter X G.I. Joe. It's very, very different from SKALD, obviously, but it's nothing but fights, brutal, awesome fights, and it's my highest profile comics work to date. If you like Street Fighter, G.I. Joe, wrestling, MMA, or comic books, you're going to love it. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.